I'm joined now by former Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Welcome to the program.
G'day, Sharri.
Now, just before we move on to Israel and your trip to Israel just recently, I want to ask you about this big story on immigration today. You're obviously a former immigration minister. What tools are available to the Albanese government in the wake of this High Court decision if it wanted to keep these 80-plus hardcore criminals off the streets?
Well, they should have been moving on legislation this week. They should have had a bill ready to go. And they would certainly, I'm sure, have a willing opposition to make sure that we could act with urgency. But it seems that we're going to be leaving here this week and the protections will still not be in place as they need to be. And that is, I think, quite reasonably concerning to everybody. I mean, I know how they got here in the first place. They came on boats that the Labor Party let in when they were in government under the Rudd years. And we're still dealing with that terrible legacy of those border protection failures all those years ago. And here we are still. So, you know, they're in a unique position where in the opposition, they will have a willing partner to be able to, you know, toughen the laws where they need to be toughened to deal with the High Court decision. But they seem to be being caught very flat-footed, and that's disappointing given the gravity of what we're talking about here. We're talking about some pretty abhorrent criminals that are being released into the community here. And I think the community has a pretty reasonable concern about this, and they would have expected more.
Look, I want to ask you about Israel now. Obviously, you've just returned from a trip to Israel this week. We've seen that first the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, said that Israel should take steps towards a ceasefire. The Prime Minister tried to walk back her comments, although not terribly convincingly. Why do you think, having just been there, do you think a ceasefire would be in Israel's best interests?
No, it would not. And it certainly would not. And what Hamas was seeking to do was use its information war and its information campaign to put pressure on Israel to do just that so they could regroup. And that would have been, even the UK opposition leader has acknowledged that. And he's certainly a much greater improvement on Jeremy Corbyn on these issues. There's no doubt about that. But that said, I think there is a common sense here that says that Hamas was seeking to apply that pressure to Israel. Israel rightly continued to pursue their very just defence on the terrible atrocities that were committed against them on the 7th of October. And we must remember that this is how this started. This is why this has happened. What we're seeing in the Middle East now is the consequences of Hamas's atrocities inflicted on Israel. That is why this is happening.
The other comments that we keep hearing from both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister is this lecturing of Israel on proportionality, on its response, they keep lecturing Israel to abide by international law, the implication being that they're not abiding by international law, when in fact Israel takes every step possible, goes above and beyond, millions of text messages, leaflets, phone calls to try and keep civilians safe.
True.
Do you think the current government is sidestepping long held on both sides of politics bipartisan approach to Israel?
I have been concerned about the sort of apparent confusion about these things coming from the government. I mean, we had a resolution in the Parliament, and that was a good resolution. I think I would have had a stronger resolution, but nevertheless, it was a good resolution and I was pleased to support it. But there has been these statements and a tone, as you said, which suggests some type of equivalency here, and there's none. That was the point that Boris Johnson and I were making when we went to Israel. Any suggestion or implication left hanging out there that there's some sort of equivalency, moral equivalency, between the atrocities committed by Hamas on Israelis and what now Israel's doing in its self-defence. And as you said, Boris and I were both taken through in quite a bit of detail by none less than the President and the Prime Minister, what they're doing in those operations to provide warning, to provide those opportunities for humanitarian relief. I mean, we're dealing with an opponent here, an enemy here, that hides in hospitals and that fires rockets from hospitals. I mean, we're not dealing with an organisation here who plays by the rules. And the idea that Israel could leave Hamas in a position where they could strengthen their position, and for that matter to go unresolved into the future, is just simply unacceptable, because there would be no possibility of Israelis being able to live in that part of their country. And so, of course, they need to pursue this. Of course, they need and are providing the necessary warnings and humanitarian corridors and pauses that you expect. And I agree with you, Sharri. I think there's this tone which indicates that, we have to tell Israel to play by the rules. Well, who's saying they're not? And why is it being raised in such a way to imply that it's not? I mean, they are a great friend of Australia, and if you can't stand with Israel in its darkest hour over an atrocity, which was the single worst day for Israel and the Jewish people since the Holocaust, then when can you? I mean, it is extraordinary. And I think the sort of speaking out of both sides of the mouth on these issues has the appearance of that. And I hope it's only the appearance of that. But the mere appearance of it is really, I found, very concerning.
No, I completely agree with you, and thank you for those strong comments. Look, we've seen an explosion in anti-Semitism just on the weekend, those protests in the heart of Jewish suburbs, Caulfield and Coogee, which also has a lot of Jewish people, but it would have terrified non-Jews as well. Plus restaurants vandalised, graves desecrated. This is unlike the Australia that we know. We're not seeing the leadership from the Prime Minister to unequivocally call this out, to hold a press conference, say this has got to stop. What would you do, Mr Morrison, if you were Prime Minister and we've seen this epidemic of anti-Semitism?
Well, let's first of all say what is obvious, and this behaviour is shameful, and I've seen it not just here in all the places you've said, but also I saw it in the UK when I was there as well. And, it is intimidating and can be terrifying to Jews in Australia and elsewhere, and it needs to be called out as such, and it needs to be said very clearly from the outset that it's just not on. I mean, I think it's on the 27th of November. In Melbourne, they're organising a school walkout. I mean, they're organising for children not to go to school and participate in an anti-Israel protest, which I just find unthinkable in this country, that children would be employed in that way in this issue. And I would be thinking that the Education Minister federally and at a state level in Victoria should be using every power and every ounce of influence they have and persuasion to ensure that just doesn't take place. I mean, I think what Australians want to see here, who feel strongly about this, is just the instinctive response. And I think the instinctiveness in terms of Australia, the government's response, hasn't been what I think they expected. And so as a result, when you leave a space, when you create, when there's a vacuum, well, it'll get filled. And that's why I think it's important to strongly make it very clear about what's expected here. And but having said that, I'd give a shout out to Chris Minns in New South Wales.
Yeah,
Chris and I went to Israel 20 years ago together. And I understand his strong views on this. Bill Shorten was with me on that visit that time 20 years ago as well. And so there are people in this parliament on both sides and in the state parliaments who know what the instinctive response should be, but I fear that Australians haven't seen it.
Scott Morrison, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Sharri.